A flight attendant cruelly kicked a black teen who was struggling with crutches. Minutes later, the CEO snapped the attendant's back over the same tray table he once mocked. What happens next will leave you speechless. He kicked a boy already struggling to walk, sending him crashing from his crutches. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The crutches slipped slightly on the airplane's narrow carpet as Darius Colton tried to steady himself in the aisle. The boarding process had just ended, the cabin still restless with the shuffle of passengers storing bags and fastening seatbelts. His leg, always a source of discomfort since the accident, throbbed under the pressure, forcing him to lean harder on the polished aluminum supports that clicked faintly with each step. The sound drew glances, some curious, others sympathetic, but one gaze in particular carried no sympathy at all. From halfway down the cabin, Malcolm Keene, the senior flight attendant, stood with arms crossed, his sharp eyes following the boy's movements like a hawk waiting for prey. A smirk tugged at his lips, not one of welcome but of derision, as though the very sight of Darius struggling was an inconvenience. Raymond Colton, Darius's uncle, moved just behind him, one hand steadying his briefcase, the other subtly ready to catch his nephew if he faltered. Raymond was a man of presence, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of figure that usually drew respect in boardrooms. Here, however, within the claustrophobic shell of the airplane, even he felt the weight of vulnerability. He noticed Malcolm's smirk, but said nothing. Instead, he leaned down to murmur, "Steady pace, Darius. We'll be seated in just a moment." His voice was calm, but his jaw was tight, the tendons at his temple flexing in silent frustration. Darius nodded, swallowing back the sting of embarrassment. "I'm fine, Uncle," he whispered, though his grip on the crutch handles betrayed his tension. His objective was simple: get to his seat, sit down, and make it through the long flight without drawing further attention. Yet, as the boy's gaze met Malcolm's, a flicker of unease ran through him. The flight attendant's smirk didn't fade when their eyes locked. Instead, it deepened, as though promising something yet to come. The cabin atmosphere was strained already. The flight had been delayed for nearly an hour, and whispers of further turbulence spread like static among the passengers. The air smelled faintly of reheated meals and disinfectant, carrying the metallic tang of recirculated oxygen. Children fidgeted in their seats, parents sighed, and businessmen checked their watches with exasperated glances. Against this backdrop of ordinary travel frustrations, the tension between a limping teenager and a disdainful attendant seemed almost invisible. Yet, to Darius, it loomed larger than the clouds they would soon pass through. When he finally reached his assigned seat near the middle of the cabin, Darius eased himself into place with practiced care, sliding his crutches against the wall beneath the window. His injured leg stretched slightly, confined by space yet desperate for relief. Raymond settled beside him, exhaling as though the simple act of sitting was a victory. But peace was fleeting. Malcolm strode down the aisle to check overhead compartments, his polished shoes tapping against the floor with sharp finality. When he passed their row, his eyes dropped to the crutches, then to the boy's pale face. "Keep those out of the aisle," Malcolm said abruptly, his voice low but edged like a blade. He didn't wait for a response, moving on as if the order required no acknowledgement. "They're not in the aisle," Darius muttered softly, more to himself than anyone else. His hand brushed the cold metal of the crutch handles, seeking reassurance in their familiar weight. Raymond heard him and gave a small shake of his head. "Let it go," his uncle whispered. His tone was firm but not dismissive, the kind of tone meant to calm but also to warn. "We'll deal with people like him differently." Darius looked out the window, jaw clenched. He thought of the countless times he had been told to ignore slights, to swallow pride in favor of peace. But this felt different. There was something in Malcolm's gaze, something deliberate, almost predatory. The engines roared as the plane prepared for takeoff, vibration trembling through the floor into Darius's bones. He gripped the armrest, forcing his breathing steady. Passengers around him shifted, buckled seatbelts tighter, murmuring prayers or idle complaints. Yet the boy's focus remained inward, battling not only the unease of flying but also the weight of humiliation waiting to pounce from a smirking man in uniform. Once the aircraft lifted and leveled, the cabin lights dimmed to a calmer glow. Conversations rose and fell like waves, laughter and sighs mingling with the hum of engines. Darius tried to relax, but his leg ached, and every adjustment felt like a spotlight on his condition. He leaned slightly into the aisle to ease the stiffness, careful not to intrude. It was then that Malcolm returned, striding past with a tray of refreshments. His eyes caught the movement instantly. "Keep it tucked or you'll trip someone," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to draw nearby glances. His words sliced through the ambient noise, and though no one spoke up, several passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Darius stiffened, heat rising in his cheeks. He opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his uncle's earlier warning echoing in his head. Raymond's hand closed briefly over his, squeezing in quiet solidarity. Malcolm moved on, unbothered, but the moment lingered. For Darius, it was more than a correction. It was the confirmation of a silent battle being staged within the narrow walls of the cabin. He could feel it in the way the passengers looked away, too polite or too afraid to interfere, in the way his uncle's silence carried the weight of restraint. In his heart, Darius resolved to endure, to remain calm, to deny Malcolm the satisfaction of reaction. Yet beneath that resolve, unease twisted like a knot. He sensed it already. The storm was coming, though no one else could yet see the clouds. Raymond leaned closer, whispering words meant to comfort. "We'll be fine once we land. Things will be different then." Better, his voice carried both hope and tension, as though he himself wasn't entirely convinced. Darius nodded faintly, eyes fixed on the aisle where Malcolm had disappeared. He could almost hear the echo of the attendant's smirk in the air around him. It wasn't over, it was only beginning. And as he tightened his grip on the armrest, forcing calm into his body, the thought pressed itself into his mind like a warning etched in steel. Sometimes the worst storms begin in silence. As the plane leveled into cruising altitude, Darius shifted in his seat and carefully adjusted the angle of his crutches. He moved them an inch closer to the armrest, making sure they were secure and out of the aisle. The action was quiet, almost invisible, but his every movement carried weight. He had learned long ago that a single mistake with those crutches could cause him pain. His brow furrowed as he tested the position, his fingers brushing the metal lightly as though seeking confirmation that they were stable. Passengers around him continued with their routines, reading newspapers, scrolling through phones, or closing their eyes to rest, yet a thin layer of tension already clung to the air. Malcolm Keene's sharp voice cut through the steady hum of the engines. "Keep it tucked or you'll trip someone," he barked, his tone carrying more command than concern. He did not lower his voice. Instead, he allowed it to ring out, drawing the attention of those nearby. His eyes narrowed, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smirk that suggested not a warning, but an accusation. The words struck Darius like a slap, leaving his chest tight and his cheeks warm. For a heartbeat, he considered replying, but instinct told him silence would serve him better. His jaw clenched, and he lowered his gaze, his fingers gripping the fabric of his jeans as though anchoring himself to restraint. Raymond, seated beside him, noticed immediately. His uncle's hand twitched against the armrest and his lips pressed into a thin line. Anger glimmered in his eyes, but he forced himself to remain still. Confronting Malcolm now, so early in the flight, might only escalate matters, and Raymond knew that a cabin in the sky was no place for uncontrolled conflict. He leaned slightly toward his nephew, whispering under his breath, "Don't worry. I see what's happening. You've done nothing wrong." His voice carried reassurance, but his jaw remained taut, the muscles betraying the effort it took to hold his anger back. Across the aisle, a man lifted his head from a magazine and glanced toward the exchange, his brows furrowing. A young traveler 2 rows back shifted in his seat, watching carefully as if weighing whether he should speak. Even a few attendants paused mid-step, their eyes flicking toward their senior colleague with brief flashes of disapproval, but none of them spoke. Their silence was a heavy cloak draped across the cabin, protecting Malcolm and isolating Darius. Darius inhaled slowly, forcing himself to steady the thundering of his heart. His mind repeated the same objective it always did in hostile situations: remain calm, avoid escalation, survive the moment. He knew from experience that anger often led to worse pain. Yet the sting of humiliation burrowed deep. The cruelty lay not in the words themselves, but in the tone, the deliberate sharpness that transformed a simple instruction into a public rebuke. His crutches, the very tools that kept him mobile, had become weapons in Malcolm's narrative, evidence of weakness, objects to mock. Malcolm lingered in the aisle a moment longer, his posture rigid, his chin lifted with a sense of superiority. The way he adjusted his uniform cuffs, tugging at the edges as though ensuring they were perfectly aligned, carried an air of arrogance. He glanced at the passengers who stared at him, his smirk widening into something closer to defiance. His message was clear. He was in control, and no one would dare challenge him. Raymond shifted again, torn between restraint and intervention. His mind raced with calculations, much like in the boardrooms where he held sway over negotiations. Yet this was not a deal to be closed with words or contracts. It was a fragile environment where power was unevenly distributed. The attendants answered to Malcolm. The passengers were bound by safety protocols, and above them all the captain was unreachable behind a sealed cockpit door. The imbalance of power pressed heavily on Raymond, narrowing his choices in ways he was not accustomed to. Darius straightened his back, determined not to show the sting he felt. He lifted his gaze toward the oval window, staring into the endless expanse of clouds as though they might absorb his pain. Yet even in the reflection, he caught sight of Malcolm's face, a face searching not for compliance, but for cracks, for the moment when restraint would falter. His smirk was not the end of the insult, but the beginning, a promise that worse was yet to come. The silence that followed was more suffocating than noise. Passengers shifted in their seats, their expressions uneasy, yet still no one spoke. The recycled air hummed through the vents, blending with the faint clatter of utensils as meals were prepared further down the aisle. To an outsider, the cabin might have looked ordinary, calm even, but beneath the surface a fuse had been lit, and everyone could feel the heat of its slow burn. Raymond leaned closer to his nephew again, his voice firmer now. "Stay calm. I'm here. He won't get away with this." The reassurance was meant to soothe, but even as he spoke, his hand curled into a fist on his lap. His nephew's quiet strength inspired him, but the injustice carved deeper with each passing second. Malcolm finally turned, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor as he continued down the aisle. Yet his eyes flicked back once, locking onto Darius with the same sharpness that had launched the insult. It was a glance heavy with promise, a predator marking prey for later. Darius exhaled, trying to steady himself. He told himself he could endure, that he would not give Malcolm the satisfaction of breaking. But deep inside, a chill whispered that this was not over, that the man's gaze carried something more than casual cruelty. The foreshadowing lingered in every detail. The way Malcolm's steps slowed near their row, the way his shoulders stiffened as though he were waiting for another excuse to pounce, the way silence pressed heavier than words. In that pressurized space, sealed off from the world below, every insult was magnified. The boy's composure, his uncle's restraint, the passenger's silence, all of it formed a fragile balance that could be shattered by the smallest spark. And in Malcolm's eyes, that spark was already gleaming, ready to ignite at the first opportunity. Every quiet insult was a fuse waiting to ignite. The tray slid from Darius's lap as Malcolm's polished shoe slammed into the crutches with a deliberate crack. Metal clattered against the cabin floor, the sound sharp and jarring, followed by a dull, sickening thud as one crutch struck Darius's leg. Pain exploded through him like fire racing up his thigh, the old injury screaming open again. His voice broke into a raw cry that echoed against the narrow walls of the fuselage, silencing even the hum of casual conversations. The plane's steady drone was no comfort now. It only heightened the unbearable contrast between routine flight and sudden brutality. Blood seeped dark and fast through the fabric of Darius's jeans, the crimson growing in uneven circles before dripping onto the speckled gray carpet. The smell of iron quickly mixed with the recycled air, making the moment feel heavier, more real. Passengers gasped. A woman clapped her hand to her mouth while an older man muttered a prayer under his breath. Phones lifted, trembling slightly, their screens glowing as cameras began to record. Raymond's chair scraped violently as he shoved himself up, his hands already reaching for his nephew. He dropped to his knees beside Darius, his tailored jacket brushing against the spreading pool on the floor. "Stay with me, Darius," he whispered fiercely, his voice tight with panic. His hand pressed against the soaked fabric, useless against the gush that pulsed beneath. The boy's face contorted, pale and slick with sweat, his lips trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. Above them, Malcolm stood tall, his smirk sharp enough to slice through the tension. He crossed his arms, tilting his head as though the entire scene was no more than a minor inconvenience. "Maybe you should keep your things out of the way," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. His voice carried, echoing across the silent cabin, magnifying the cruelty etched into every syllable. Gasps rippled again, this time followed by whispers. "That wasn't an accident," a passenger murmured, shaking his head. Another hissed under his breath. I got it on camera." Still, none rose from their seats, their unease growing as fear of confrontation tangled with indignation. Darius's body convulsed as another wave of pain surged through his leg. He gripped his uncle's sleeve desperately, nails digging into the fabric, his voice no more than a broken whisper. "I can't breathe, right?" His chest heaved, not from lack of air but from the crushing weight of humiliation, of being exposed in such a vulnerable state before strangers. Raymond looked up, his eyes sharp with fury. The boardrooms where he had always spoken with calm authority were far away. Here, his words cracked with helpless anger. "You hurt him on purpose," he barked, his voice low but heavy enough to vibrate with promise. Malcolm shrugged, the movement slow, arrogant, dismissive. "Accidents happen," he muttered, looking away as though the sight of blood bored him. The cabin's mood shifted, unease tightening into outrage. Passengers leaned into the aisle, their faces pale but intent. Phones hovered higher, recording every flicker of movement, every line of cruelty etched on Malcolm's face. Yet the dramatic irony was unbearable. This was a man sworn to serve, and yet he stood weaponized by his uniform, shielded by silence. Raymond pressed harder on the wound, feeling the warmth of blood soak through his hands. His chest tightened with dread as he thought of how fragile the boy's body already was, how one cruel kick had undone months of fragile healing. He cursed himself silently for not stepping in earlier, for letting the smirks and sharp words go unanswered. Every second replayed in his head like a chain of missed warnings. Darius groaned again, his eyes fluttering. "Uncle," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Don't let him." His words dissolved into sobs, swallowed by pain. Raymond gritted his teeth, his jaw clenching hard enough to ache. His heart thundered in his chest, not just with fear for his nephew's life, but with a growing fire that made his muscles tremble. Malcolm leaned against the seatback, his posture casual, as though this scene belonged to him. He scanned the passengers, smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, enjoying the control that no one dared strip away. Yet behind the arrogance, Raymond caught something else, a flicker of calculation, a man who believed he could walk away untouchable because the cabin was his domain. Foreshadowing lingered in the air like storm clouds. The silence of the passengers was not submission, it was the waiting stillness before a storm breaks. Each recording phone was a witness, each whispered protest a seed of rebellion. Raymond knew, even in the chaos of blood and agony, that this moment was more than pain. It was the spark of something larger. The cabin had become an arena, the walls pressing in close, trapping cruelty and suffering within 30,000 feet of air. And at the center stood Malcolm, his smirk no longer an expression but a challenge. For Darius, the boy who had entered the plane with quiet resilience, his objective had changed in an instant. No longer endurance, no longer survival without notice, it was survival itself, raw and immediate, with the shadow of humiliation as sharp as the pain in his leg. The hush of the crowd deepened, every breath sharp, every whisper dangerous. Somewhere in the back a man muttered, "He's not going to get away with this." The words carried faint but heavy, threading through the rows like the beginning of a verdict. And above the gasps, above the weight of fear and silence, the smirk on Malcolm's face stretched wider, as though he alone controlled the sky. The kick shattered more than bone. It broke the silence of the flight. Raymond's hands pressed hard against the torn fabric of Darius's jeans, his palms slick with warm blood that pulsed stubbornly through his fingers. The wound beneath was angry and raw, a crimson betrayal that mocked his helplessness. The hum of the engines, steady and unyielding, seemed to amplify the boy's shallow groans. The narrow fuselage smelled of iron and panic, filling every breath with the weight of desperation. Raymond's jaw clenched as his nephew writhed beneath his grip, the teenager's face pale, lips trembling as he whispered fragments of words lost to pain. "Stay with me, Darius." "Just stay with me," Raymond urged, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound strong. His throat burned, his business-trained composure cracking under the suffocating reality that no negotiation, no contract, no polished speech could mend the fracture spilling blood across the cabin carpet. His eyes darted to the aisle, searching for help, for any sign of humanity among the crew. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some wide-eyed, others fumbling with call buttons, their voices rising in a chorus of demands. "Medical kit! Get a doctor! Do something!" Their panic reflected his own, but none of it brought the relief he needed. The cramped space magnified the chaos until every sound felt like an echo of failure. Raymond was used to commanding boardrooms where a single raised hand silenced a crowd. Here, his voice was one among many, drowned in the suffocating air of helplessness. Malcolm stood nearby, his expression void of urgency. His lips curled in a faint dismissive sneer as he muttered, "Accidents occur." The words cut deeper than the wound itself. Raymond's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing on the man who had kicked the crutches and unleashed this spiral of suffering. He wanted to shout, to drag Malcolm into the pool of blood and force him to face what he had done, but his nephew's weak cry kept him anchored to the floor. The cruelty of Malcolm's composure pressed against him like a vice. Raymond's breathing quickened, each inhale dragging in the recycled air thick with fear. His tie felt strangling, his shirt collar soaked with sweat. He thought of boardroom negotiations where power was measured by influence and wealth, by subtle words and carefully calculated pauses. Yet here, in this narrow row, the rules were different. His company shares, his reputation, his contracts, all meaningless against the sight of a 17-year-old boy fighting not just pain, but humiliation. The attendants, younger and clearly uneasy, hesitated at Malcolm's shadow. One reached for the medical kit in the galley, only to freeze under the weight of the senior attendant's glare. The fear in their posture was obvious, their eyes flicking between the bleeding boy and the man who commanded their obedience. Raymond saw it clearly. Authority had twisted into cowardice. He felt the heat of anger rise, a slow burn in his chest that threatened to consume what little calm he clung to. "Help him," Raymond barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the cabin noise. He looked directly at the hesitant attendant. "Don't look at him. Look at me. Bring the kit." Now, his voice carried the authority of a man who had signed billion-dollar deals. But here it was raw, stripped of corporate polish, pulsing with fury. The attendant faltered, torn between the cold dominance of Malcolm and the urgent command of a desperate uncle. Yet Malcolm stepped forward, his voice steady but sharp, the tone of a man convinced he was untouchable. "Sit down, sir," Malcolm said, folding his arms across his chest, his smirk deepening. "You're not in control here. Don't make this worse for yourself." The words dug into Raymond like claws. He looked down at Darius, who was clutching his uncle's wrist with what little strength he had, eyes glossy with pain and confusion. That sight crushed him more than Malcolm's taunts. His nephew was bleeding, apologizing under his breath as if guilt belonged to him. "I'm sorry, Uncle. I'm sorry," the boy whispered faintly, his lips trembling. "You did nothing wrong," Raymond replied fiercely, his voice breaking but resolute. His grip on the wound tightened, though blood still seeped between his fingers, painting them in shades of red that would never wash away in his memory. He leaned close to Darius's ear, whispering words only the boy could hear. "This isn't your fault. I swear to you, it's not your fault." The hum of the engines continued, indifferent to the human storm within its walls. Passengers shifted uneasily, their eyes fixed on Raymond, on Malcolm, on the boy bleeding into the carpet. Phones began to lift, screens glowing, recording every second of cruelty and resistance. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what Raymond would do next. And in that silence, Raymond felt a shift inside himself. His mind no longer lingered on contracts or investors or the fragile image of a man in control. It turned instead to geometry, the narrow aisles, the tray tables, the rigid seats bolted to the floor. Every piece of the cabin became part of a map in his imagination, a battlefield disguised as comfort. He studied Malcolm's stance, his arrogance, the way he assumed the cabin belonged to him. That arrogance was a weakness. It blinded him to the quiet fire rising in Raymond's chest. Raymond lowered his gaze back to the bloodied leg beneath his hands, then lifted it once more to Malcolm's indifferent eyes. Something inside him hardened into resolve. He had lived his life measuring power through wealth and decisions that shaped industries, but that power meant nothing here. Now, stripped of titles, of boardrooms, and of control, he discovered another form of power, one born not from money but from pain, rage, and love. Passengers whispered nervously, sensing a storm building in the silence between breaths. Some looked at Malcolm and shook their heads in disbelief. Others leaned closer, murmuring about justice. Foreshadowing lingered in the air, a warning cloaked in anticipation. Raymond could feel it in the pounding of his own heart, in the tension of his knuckles pressed against torn denim, in the way Malcolm's smirk dared him to rise. And he knew, in that moment, that the flight had changed. It was no longer a journey of business. It was something darker, something heavier. It was a reckoning waiting to be written in the cramped geometry of the cabin, with passengers as silent witnesses and justice balanced on a fragile edge. Some men measured power through wealth, others through violence. But Raymond, stripped of boardrooms and titles, was about to redefine it through vengeance. What began as a journey of business was becoming a trial of blood and honor. The cries of pain from Darius spread through the cabin like wildfire. His sharp, anguished scream cut through the low hum of the engines, freezing every conversation, every clink of glass, every shuffled page of a magazine. Heads turned, necks craned, and an unsettling silence began to grow between the gasps of startled passengers. The sound of a boy in pain was impossible to ignore, and yet, within that silence, no one moved quickly enough. It was as if the whole cabin were waiting to see who would act first. Passengers began shouting in scattered voices, calling for someone to alert the captain. One man in a business suit stood halfway out of his seat and shouted, "Get him help now!" Another voice, more desperate, yelled, "Restrain that attendant before he hurts him again!" The words echoed, overlapping with the insistent chime of call buttons lighting up row by row, a chorus of desperate demands for order. But the crew faltered. Younger attendants froze in place, their hands trembling as they clutched service trays, their eyes darting between the bleeding boy and the tall figure of Malcolm Keene. Raymond's focus, however, was narrowed to one thing: his nephew. He locked eyes with Darius, whose face was pale with shock, his lips trembling from both pain and humiliation. In that gaze, Raymond did not just see agony, he saw the unbearable weight of a boy crushed not only by injury, but by the merciless eyes of strangers. The thought carved deep into Raymond's chest. This child, who had already fought through so much, was being broken again, not by fate, but by cruelty. And Malcolm stood there, unmoved. He leaned casually against the seatback nearest him, arms folded across his chest, one foot braced as if he were the master of this domain. His smirk was not just arrogance, it was contempt, sharpened into a blade that he used to slice at the dignity of the boy. He did not hide it. He wanted the passengers to see his dominance, to believe in it. The more Raymond studied him, the more he understood that Malcolm thrived on humiliation, that he was measuring his control not by the boy's pain but by how long the rest of them would remain silent. That smirk became fuel. Something inside Raymond began to shift, hardening like molten metal cooling into steel. His jaw tightened until the muscles quivered, and his hands curled into fists that he forced to remain steady on the armrests. He told himself that to lash out now would mean chaos, but to do nothing would mean surrendering not just his nephew's dignity, but his own. Raymond rose halfway from his seat, his voice steady but trembling beneath the weight of fury. "This has gone too far," he said, his tone carrying across the cabin. "I'm speaking to the captain." He reached for the intercom mounted near the aisle, his hand moving with deliberate calm. Every passenger who watched knew what that gesture meant, a call for authority higher than the man who had just inflicted such harm. For a moment, hope flickered across faces. Perhaps the balance of power would shift. Perhaps justice would enter through the cockpit door. But Malcolm was faster. With a movement as sharp as a whip crack, he lunged forward, yanking the intercom from Raymond's grasp. The cord twisted, the plastic unit swinging violently before he clutched it tight. His voice dropped low, dangerous, meant for Raymond but loud enough for all to hear. "Sit down," he hissed, his eyes glinting like cold glass, "or I'll have you reported for interference." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Interference. The word carried weight in a cabin sealed thousands of feet above the earth. It meant charges, black marks, ruined reputations. The passengers stiffened, some lowering their eyes, others glaring at Malcolm with disbelief. But the hesitation was real. The system was built to protect crew, not passengers, and Malcolm knew it. His confidence was born of the very rules he twisted. Raymond did not sit. His body stayed rigid, every muscle resisting the command. His chest rose and fell in sharp, controlled breaths. He felt the weight of eyes upon him, the passengers waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. Was he the polished CEO they expected to step aside quietly? Or was he something else, something forged in the fire of betrayal and blood? For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was Darius's ragged breathing, the stifled sob that slipped from his throat as he shifted in his seat, clutching at his ruined leg. Raymond's heart clenched at the sight. His nephew, The boy who had endured so much was whispering apologies even now, as though his pain were an inconvenience. It was unbearable. The silence cracked when a voice from the back muttered, "This isn't right." Another added, louder this time, "You can't just let him get away with this." The murmurs built, a low rumble of passengers who had been silent too long, but still no one moved. Their words floated like smoke, dissipating before they could ignite into action. Malcolm, sensing their hesitation, smirked again, leaning back with the intercom still dangling from his hand. He tilted his head at Raymond, a silent dare, as if to say, "You won't do it. Not here. Not now." But he was wrong. In that moment, Raymond's objective crystallized. He was no longer a CEO, bound by contracts and reputations. He was no longer a man of negotiations or polished speeches. He was an uncle betrayed, a protector ignited, a man whose family had been trampled before his very eyes. And though the cabin walls pressed tight around him, though the rules of the sky had been written to keep him powerless, his imagination for retribution broke through those limits like flame through dry paper. Passengers would later recall the look in his eyes, the way his shoulders squared, the way he seemed to grow taller in the narrow aisle. It was the look of a man who had crossed a line within himself. He had stepped into a place where there was no return, and every choice from here would be irreversible. The intercom swung loosely in Malcolm's grip, but Raymond no longer saw it as a tool of authority. He saw only his nephew's trembling hands, the blood spreading across the boy's jeans, the humiliation etched into his pale face. He heard the cruel echo of Malcolm's voice, the way he had barked commands, the way he had sneered at pain. And in that boiling silence, a truth emerged. It was no longer about what Malcolm had done, it was about what Raymond would do next. Darius's voice cracked weakly, a broken whisper slipping from his lips as his eyelids fluttered half-closed. "I'm sorry. For causing trouble." His words, frail as a thread, carried across the narrow cabin, striking Raymond harder than any physical blow could. The boy's apology was not just unnecessary, it was unbearable. Raymond's chest tightened as he gripped Darius's trembling hand, his own fingers slick with the boy's blood. His nephew's skin felt clammy, too cold for someone so young. Rage mingled with sorrow until the two emotions became indistinguishable, searing through Raymond like a fire he could no longer suppress. "You did nothing wrong," Raymond hissed, his voice fierce yet low, as if daring anyone nearby to contradict him. His jaw locked, and his eyes glistened with something darker than tears. He leaned closer so Darius could hear the conviction in his voice. "You hear me?" Nothing. Darius blinked faintly, his lips pressing into the faintest of nods before another wave of pain dragged him toward unconsciousness. Around them, the passengers stirred like restless witnesses at a trial, their hushed voices overlapping in confusion and outrage. A man a few rows back muttered, "This airline is finished?" Lawsuit waiting to happen. Another added, "They'll never get away with this." Yet their anger was abstract, their energy scattered, while the bleeding boy lay broken in his seat. Raymond heard them, but their words washed over him without meaning. His mind was not with lawyers or courts, it was with Malcolm, the man who still stood smug and untouchable in the aisle. Malcolm leaned casually against a seatback, his arms folded as if this suffering child were nothing more than a minor inconvenience delaying the beverage service. The slight tilt of his mouth was not a smile but a smirk of ownership, the arrogance of a man who believed the cabin was his stage and every passenger his audience. He exuded false control, but Raymond saw through it. That arrogance wasn't strength, it was a crack waiting to split wide open. Raymond's breathing slowed. He forced himself to steady the tremor of fury pulsing through his veins. Anger was wild and reckless, but he needed clarity, precision. His gaze shifted from Malcolm to the cabin itself, his mind dissecting the space the way he once dissected complex contracts at boardroom tables. The narrow aisles, the tight rows, the tray tables that folded like fragile shields, the armrests that trapped bodies into corners, all of it was geometry. All of it was power. He traced possibilities in his head as though the cabin itself were a chessboard. Malcolm had used its confines to dominate, to bark orders, to strip dignity, to lash out without fear of consequence. But Raymond realized the same features could be reversed, turned into weapons of control. The aisle that confined movement could corner a man. The tray table that once mocked fragility could bear a far heavier weight. The armrest that hemmed in a boy's body could pin another into place. Raymond's shoulders lowered, not in defeat, but in calculation. His eyes narrowed as he studied Malcolm's posture, the way he leaned with too much confidence, oblivious to how closely the passengers watched him now. Malcolm believed himself invincible because of the uniform stitched across his chest, but Raymond recognized the truth. Uniforms tear, authority collapses, arrogance blinds. One attendant, younger and nervous, edged closer with a medical kit clutched tight to his chest, but Malcolm shot him a glance sharp enough to send him retreating. Raymond noted the hesitation of the crew, fear of their superior, fear of consequence. That, too, was weakness. It meant that when Malcolm fell, none would rush to his rescue. The low hum of the engines filled the silence, vibrating through the floor beneath Raymond's shoes. He tightened his grip on Darius's hand once more, and the boy whimpered, his head rolling against the seat back. "Hold on," Raymond whispered, his voice calmer now but edged with iron. "Just hold on." His eyes flicked up to Malcolm again, and in that gaze there was no fear left, no hesitation, only intent. Passengers exchanged glances, sensing the shift. They could not hear Raymond's thoughts, but they felt his resolve like a storm-building pressure before it breaks. A man in the row ahead leaned toward his wife and murmured, "Something's about to happen." Dramatic irony thickened the air. Malcolm still believed he commanded the cabin, but every set of eyes was already turning against him, waiting for a reckoning. Raymond leaned back slightly, drawing in a deep breath, the kind one takes before stepping into a boardroom battle or onto a battlefield. But this was neither. It was both. The stakes were no longer business contracts or corporate reputations. The stakes were dignity, blood, and survival. The humiliation Malcolm thought he had etched into the boy's memory would instead carve itself into his own downfall. The moment stretched, taut, and brittle. Every clatter of turbulence, every hiss of the ventilation system, every shallow gasp from Darius amplified the tension. Raymond's heart beat in rhythm with the engines, steady but gaining force. He saw it clearly now. Survival was not enough. Defense was not enough. This was about transformation. The cabin was no longer a prison. It was no longer Malcolm's theater. It would become something else entirely. Raymond straightened, his eyes glinting with a quiet fire that only the closest passengers noticed. He was no longer the CEO traveling to a summit, no longer the restrained uncle begging for civility. He was something sharper, something dangerous, shaped by grief and ignited by injustice. Malcolm smirked again, mistaking Raymond's calm silence for submission. But what Malcolm mistook for surrender was actually calculation. Passengers began filming openly now, their phones angled like the lenses of silent jurors, each one capturing the cruelty that unfolded in the narrow cabin. The glow of screens lit the dimmed aisle lights, reflecting off anxious faces. Malcolm snapped his head toward them, his voice sharp and commanding. "Put those away." "This isn't a circus." His tone was more a bark than a request, his face reddening as veins rose along his temples. Yet the phones did not waver. Some hands trembled, but none lowered. The silence of the passengers no longer belonged to fear, it was an unspoken defiance. Every second recorded was a challenge to the authority Malcolm believed he owned. An older man in the first row leaned closer to his seatmate, his whisper just audible in the tense quiet. "This is going to end badly." His eyes darted between Malcolm and Raymond, then to the boy slumped against the armrest. The words seemed less like a prediction and more like a verdict already written. Malcolm, however, mistook their stillness for hesitation. His smirk returned, thin and cruel, as he strutted toward Raymond. The narrow aisle made his presence suffocating, his shadow falling across Darius's pale face. He raised his chin with the air of a ruler surveying subjects, convinced the passengers would stay quiet. Yet the very silence he trusted was swelling into something heavier, a storm forming just beyond his control. Raymond pressed the call button again, his movements deliberate, his jaw set. The sharp chime rang through the cabin, a demand for aid that could not be ignored. From the rear, another attendant hurried forward, clutching the bright red medical kit as if it were salvation itself. His hands shook, his steps hesitant, but his eyes darted to the boy bleeding in his seat. He reached out instinctively to pass the kit, but Malcolm cut across him like a blade. "Leave it," Malcolm ordered, his voice low and icy. He stretched out one hand, palm flat, his body blocking the aisle. His stare pinned the younger attendant in place, reducing him to silence. The kit wavered between them, salvation hanging by a strap, before the attendant lowered it reluctantly, his eyes falling in shame. Gasps rippled through the rows. A man in the middle seat shook his head in disbelief. "You're denying him help?" "He's just a boy." His voice cracked with outrage, but Malcolm didn't turn. He stood tall, crossing his arms, as if his refusal was an act of principle rather than cruelty. The game was clear now to everyone. Deny aid, deepen pain, maintain dominance, but dominance is fragile when eyes are watching. Passengers exchanged glances, small nods passing between strangers who suddenly felt united. Their whispers rose into murmurs, and the murmurs pressed into a current of defiance. A few men in the back rose halfway from their seats before hesitating, their instincts checked by the sealed walls of the cabin and the authority Malcolm still held. Raymond leaned close to Darius, gripping his nephew's trembling hand. The boy's skin was clammy, his breath shallow. Raymond's voice was quiet, steady, though anger shook beneath it. "Hold on, son. I'm here." His words were meant for comfort, but inside, he felt the weight of powerlessness crushing him. His wealth, his influence, his control over boardrooms, all useless here. In this cramped space, power belonged to the one most willing to wield it. Malcolm leaned down slightly, his voice dripping with mockery. "See? No one is going to save you. Not him, not them. Up here, I decide who gets help." He spread his arms as if the cabin itself was his kingdom. It was then that Darius, through clenched teeth and a pale face, forced out a whisper. "Uncle, don't let him win." The words cracked in the air, soft yet thunderous, fragile yet unbreakable. Raymond froze, his chest tightening. The boy's plea cut deeper than the sight of his blood. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't about dignity stolen or authority abused. It was about justice. Justice for a boy too young to bear such cruelty. Justice that could not be delayed until landing or left to the mercy of reports and courts. The passengers heard it too. The whisper seemed to ripple through them, their eyes hardening, their phones held higher. They were no longer silent witnesses. They were waiting, expecting, almost daring Raymond to act. The tension thickened, pressing against the fuselage like the weight of the sky itself. Malcolm, oblivious, mistook the moment. He smirked once more, misreading the silence as weakness. He adjusted his tie with mock casualness, savoring the illusion of control. Yet the balance had already shifted. The authority he clung to was crumbling, its foundation eaten away by the quiet fury of the crowd and the spark that now burned in Raymond's chest. In that sealed cabin, where air was recycled and time seemed suspended, the stage was set. The boy's words had become a banner, and Raymond felt them brand themselves into his heart. The next move would not be measured in wealth or status, but in resolve. And though the world outside had no idea of the storm forming 30,000 feet above the ground, every man on board could sense it coming. The boy's plea was not just for healing, it was for justice. He thought mocking a disabled black teen mid-flight would go unanswered. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The cabin lurched violently as turbulence slammed through the aircraft, rattling trays, sloshing drinks, and sending overhead compartments quivering on their hinges. Gasps rippled among the passengers, some clutching their armrests, others gripping the seats in front of them as if that thin fabric could anchor them against the storm outside. Darius moaned faintly, the jolt sending another spike of pain through his already broken leg. Raymond instinctively bent over him, one arm braced against the armrest, shielding the boy as though his body could form a shield against both the shaking metal and the cruel man still standing in the aisle. Malcolm staggered, his polished shoes slipping on the thin carpet. For a brief moment his arms flailed wildly, breaking the mask of superiority he wore so confidently. He reached out, his hand slamming down against the nearest surface for balance. The passengers closest to the aisle saw it, the irony of it, the twisted poetry. Malcolm, who had mocked, sneered, and crushed dignity with his words and actions, was now depending on the very tray table he had ridiculed earlier. His palm pressed hard against the flimsy plastic, the hinge squealing in protest under his weight. Raymond's eyes locked on the moment. It was as if the world had paused just for him, narrowing into a single frame of fate. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face betrayed no emotion, only a calm mask hiding the storm raging inside. He remembered Darius's earlier joke, whispered with a laugh that now felt so far away. "Everything up here feels fragile, like it could all just snap if someone leaned too hard." The words came back with brutal clarity, the irony of a boy's observation transforming into prophecy. The plane steadied slightly, though tremors still rolled through the cabin. Passengers murmured, some whispering prayers, others muttering that this flight was cursed. A middle-aged man in the next row leaned toward his seatmate and whispered, "Look at him. He's hanging on to it like his life depends on it." The seatmate only nodded, eyes darting nervously between Raymond and Malcolm, sensing that something far more dangerous than turbulence was about to erupt. Malcolm caught himself and straightened, brushing his jacket with exaggerated composure as though erasing the image of his stumble. His smirk returned, brittle but defiant. "Nothing but a little bump," he muttered, loud enough for several passengers to hear. His voice carried false confidence, but his tightened jaw betrayed the humiliation he felt at having shown weakness. Raymond remained silent, but his mind burned with calculation. Every detail of the cabin, its narrow aisles, its flimsy fixtures, its false sense of order shifted in his vision. The plane itself was no longer just transport, it had become a stage. He could almost hear Darius's pained breaths syncing with the hum of the engines, urging him forward, whispering that this wasn't over. A teenage boy a few rows behind raised his phone again, recording Malcolm's stumble. His father leaned in and whispered, "Keep filming. People need to see what happens next." Malcolm noticed the phone and snarled, but before he could bark an order, the plane jolted again, forcing him to steady himself once more on the tray. The passengers' eyes widened. This time, they weren't seeing just an attendant. They were seeing a man trapped by the same object he had used to humiliate. Raymond's fists clenched. His knuckles whitened, veins rising against his skin, as if his own body could no longer contain the fire building within. He lowered himself closer to Darius and whispered softly, his voice trembling with both resolve and fury. "He doesn't know it yet, but that table has already chosen a side." Darius blinked, half-conscious, his lips parting as though to speak, but only a weak breath escaped. The storm outside rattled again, trays clattering, a soda can rolling down the aisle until it hit the heel of Raymond's shoe. He nudged it aside with slow precision, every movement deliberate. Malcolm looked down, his eyes meeting Raymond's, and for the first time a flicker of unease crossed his face. He could see it. The calmness in Raymond was not surrender. It was something colder, sharper. The silence thickened, heavier than the recycled air. Passengers leaned forward unconsciously, caught in the gravity of the moment. Some bit their lips, others exchanged nervous glances, each aware that the turbulence had not just shaken the plane, it had shaken the balance of power. Malcolm tried to reassert control, raising his chin and muttering, "Sit back down." "I'm still in charge here," but his words rang hollow, drifting into a space already charged with tension. The authority in his tone was weaker now, betrayed by the tremor in his voice that only sharp ears could detect. Raymond did not move, did not blink. He only straightened, his chest rising slowly, his eyes locked on Malcolm's hand, still brushing the tray table. In that instant, the flimsy plastic no longer looked fragile, it looked inevitable, like a fulcrum waiting to tip the entire story toward its breaking point. And deep inside Raymond, the storm that had been building finally found its center. Every humiliation, every cry of pain, every ounce of silence had pooled into one place, ready to burst. He knew that when the moment came, it would be swift, decisive, and unstoppable. The passengers felt it too, though they couldn't name it. It was in the way the air seemed heavier, the way the hum of the engines blended with the pounding of their own hearts. Dramatic irony wrapped around them. They saw Malcolm's arrogance, Raymond's silence, and the fragile table between them, yet none could predict how quickly that fragile surface would decide their fates. Raymond's hands curled tighter, his breathing controlled, his posture steady as if preparing for impact. He wasn't reacting to turbulence anymore. He was answering something far greater, something Malcolm had unleashed but did not understand. Every shake of the cabin was an omen, warning Malcolm that balance was about to be lost forever. The confrontation ignited when Malcolm bent low over Raymond, his shadow stretching across the narrow aisle like a predator poised to strike. His voice was sharp and mocking, meant to cut deeper than any blade. "You think money makes you powerful? Up here, I'm in charge." The words slithered through the cabin, but they fell flat, bouncing against walls lined with judgmental stares and glowing phone screens raised like silent witnesses. The passengers, once hesitant and quiet, now became an audience holding their breath, waiting for the moment when words would finally turn into action. Raymond's eyes, usually calm and measured in business negotiations, narrowed with a fury that few had ever seen. He rose slowly, the motion deliberate, every inch of his frame unfolding with authority. Though the cabin was cramped, his presence seemed to expand, filling the space with an intensity that silenced even the murmurs. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, yet his voice carried the weight of thunder when he finally spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Gasps rippled through the rows, and even the hum of the engines seemed to dim under the gravity of those words. Malcolm's smirk faltered for a brief second, a flicker of doubt flashing in his eyes, but arrogance quickly drowned it out. He squared his shoulders, convinced that his seniority and the uniform on his chest shielded him from any real consequence. What he failed to see was that Raymond had shed all hesitation. His objective was clear. This was no longer about corporate titles or restrained civility. It was about justice. With a sudden burst of speed that startled every witness, Raymond lunged forward. His hand shot out, gripping Malcolm's arm with a force that spoke not just of strength but of unshakable determination. The older man staggered, his balance thrown off as Raymond twisted and shoved him back against the nearest tray table. The metal hinges groaned, the flimsy plastic surface quivering under the impact. It was the same tray table that moments ago had been an ordinary object of convenience, but now it transformed into something far more ominous. Passengers cried out, their voices rising in a chaotic mix of fear and awe. "Stop!" one man shouted, his tone more shocked than commanding. Another voice, shaky but resolute, whispered, "Film everything." Dozens of phones tilted higher, their tiny red lights glowing as they captured history unfolding in a steel tube, hurtling through the sky. The cabin's atmosphere tightened, every breath shallow, every second stretching longer than the last. Malcolm twisted violently, his uniform brushing against the seats as he tried to pull free. His face reddened with exertion, veins standing out along his neck. "Let go of me," he barked, his voice cracking, betraying the panic swelling beneath his bravado. But Raymond's grip was iron, his fingers digging into the fabric of Malcolm's sleeve, his knuckles pale with the effort. Years of boardroom restraint had hardened into something new, an unshakable resolve that no words could undo. Raymond's mind raced, but it was not with fear. His thoughts were clear, sharpened by the memory of Darius lying broken and bleeding just feet away. Every cry of pain, every drop of blood staining the carpet had carved itself into Raymond's chest like a brand. This moment was not only about punishment, it was about reclaiming dignity stolen in front of an entire crowd. He could not undo what Malcolm had done, but he could ensure the boy's suffering was not ignored. Malcolm's legs kicked against the aisle, knocking into seat edges as he flailed for control. His hands clawed at Raymond's arm, but the older man did not waver. The tray table beneath Malcolm creaked ominously, the thin bolts straining against the unnatural weight. The sound sent shivers through the cabin, a reminder of just how fragile the barrier between restraint and violence truly was. "Sir, please," one younger passenger pleaded, his tone breaking, yet even he didn't rise from his seat. It was as though the entire cabin had agreed, without words, that this confrontation belonged to Raymond and Malcolm alone. The others were no longer participants, only witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. Raymond's voice dropped to a low growl, meant for Malcolm alone, though every ear strained to hear. "You broke my boy. You mocked his pain. Now you answer for it." His face was a mask of control, but his eyes blazed with a fury that left no doubt he meant every word. The irony was sharp. Malcolm had believed himself untouchable, but now he was the one pinned, powerless beneath the hands of the man he had tried to belittle. The tray table quivered again, its hinges squealing like a warning. Gasps rose once more, louder now, carrying the weight of inevitability. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, some whispering prayers, others whispering encouragement. The air was electric, filled with the tension of something irreversible about to unfold. Malcolm thrashed harder, his breath ragged, but Raymond pressed him down with the force of a man who had already chosen his path. Every second carried a pulse of suspense, each heartbeat echoing louder than the hum of the engines. The recording phones trembled slightly in the hands of those who held them, not from turbulence but from the weight of realization. They were capturing more than a fight. They were capturing a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered long after the plane touched the ground. Malcolm's voice broke into a hoarse cry. "This is madness." His words rang hollow, his authority stripped bare before the crowd. For the first time, fear carved itself openly across his face. Raymond, steady and resolute, tightened his hold, leaning closer, his whisper carrying the tone of a verdict already decided. The cabin seemed to lean with him, every eye drawn to the struggle, every breath synchronized in expectation. The irony had come full circle. The same table meant to hold meals now carried the weight of judgment. Passengers who once cowered under Malcolm's authority now waited for his downfall, their silence no longer fear, but anticipation. The plane continued forward, steady in its path, but inside the cabin the balance of power had shifted forever. Raymond, once a man of calm calculation, now became the embodiment of retribution. He had chosen his moment, and nothing would turn him back. The foreshadowing became reality in that instant. The tray table that had mocked fragility was about to become an executioner's block. The tray table creaked under the crushing weight as Raymond forced Malcolm down, the flimsy plastic bending but refusing to snap. The sound reverberated through the cabin, louder than the faint hum of the engines, and for a moment it seemed the entire plane was holding its breath. Malcolm's face pressed against the cold, smooth surface, his breath ragged and desperate. His arms flailed wildly, fists striking at the air as though he could claw his way out of the trap. But Raymond's grip, firm and unyielding, held him in place. The strength surprised even Raymond himself. It felt as if every ounce of pain his nephew had endured had transformed into raw energy pulsing through his veins. Passengers leaned forward, their eyes wide, phones raised like glowing witnesses in the dimmed cabin. Some mouths hung open in silent shock, others whispered hurriedly, their voices blending with the nervous murmur of the air system. The tension was electric, stretching across the rows until every soul aboard was locked into the drama unfolding only a few feet away. The fragile order of the flight had dissolved, replaced with a theater of justice no one had bought tickets to see. Malcolm twisted, spitting words between clenched teeth. "You think this will change anything?" His voice was sharp, filled with defiance, yet the tremor behind it betrayed fear. His body writhed like a trapped animal, legs kicking against the narrow aisle, shoes thudding against the metal floor. Still, Raymond pressed harder, his face close, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a fury that left no space for hesitation. "You broke my boy," Raymond said, his voice low. Every word weighted like a stone dropped into still water. His lips barely moved, but the force of his tone carried across the rows. He leaned closer, his breath steady, controlled, yet charged with a rage that seemed carved from years of suppressed patience. "Now, this table will break you." The words cut through the cabin like a blade, freezing every passenger in place. The irony struck them all at once. The very object that symbolized frailty and convenience, the thing that bore their meals and drinks, had become the stage for something far more primal. A murmur rippled through the rows, some gasps muffled, others sharp and loud. A young man near the back whispered to the man beside him, "He's really going to do it." The reply came in a hushed tremor, "He already has." Malcolm's resistance faltered as the pressure built. His hands clawed at Raymond's forearms, his nails digging but finding no give. His breaths turned into ragged wheezes, sweat dripping down his temples, his face reddening as the tray table pressed deeper into his chest and spine. The table groaned again, as though straining against the role it had been forced into. Every sound echoed across the cabin, each creak magnified by the silence of those watching. Passengers gripped armrests, some trembling, others unable to look away. Phones continued to record, their screens glowing with the truth that could not be erased. The engines outside droned on steadily, indifferent to the human storm brewing within. The dim cabin lights flickered once with the turbulence, like a signal of the inevitability about to crash down. It was a moment suspended between restraint and release, and everyone knew which way it would fall. Raymond's muscles tightened, his resolve solidifying into action. With cold calculation, he twisted, leveraging not just his strength but his understanding of angles, of weight, of fragility turned against arrogance. His motions were precise, controlled, almost surgical in their cruelty. For a split second, time seemed to stretch, giving Malcolm one last chance to understand the depth of his mistake. His eyes widened, terror blooming as realization dawned. Then it came. The crack. A sickening, jagged sound that shattered the cabin's silence, louder than the roar of the engines, louder than the cries that followed. Malcolm's spine bent unnaturally over the tray, his body jerking once before going limp. The noise reverberated inside every passenger's chest, a sound that could never be forgotten. Some cried out in horror, others clapped hands to their mouths, a few even recoiled as if the sound itself had struck them. Blood rushed into Malcolm's face, turning his skin a violent shade of crimson. His arms fell uselessly to his sides, his body draped awkwardly across the table. His mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. The defiance was gone, replaced by silence and stillness. Raymond stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes locked not on Malcolm but on the boy who had been kicked and humiliated moments before. Every action, every ounce of fury had been for that boy. Darius, pale and weak, blinked through the haze of pain, his breaths shallow. His wide eyes reflected both terror and awe, a conflict of emotions he could not name. To him, this was justice, but also something far darker. The man who had mocked him lay broken, but the price of that justice now weighed heavily in the cabin's stale air. The boy's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only a soft groan as the truth of what had happened washed over him. Passengers shifted uneasily, unsure whether to cheer or condemn. Some lowered their phones, their hands trembling as they realized the gravity of what they had captured. Others continued recording, determined to keep the proof alive. The tension did not vanish with the crack, it only deepened, settling into their bones as the reality took hold. And yet, in that suspended moment, Raymond knew this was not just an act of rage. It was something larger, something irreversible that would ripple far beyond the metal walls of the aircraft. The silence of the cabin carried that weight, pressing down on every witness. For Darius, justice and terror had become entwined, and for Raymond, vengeance had found its form, echoing in the sound that could not be undone. The sound of breaking bone was not just an end, it was the beginning of something far larger. Chaos surged instantly. Some passengers screamed for help, others clapped, and a few simply stared in stunned silence. The sound of breathing seemed amplified, the recycled air whistling faintly through the vents as if even the plane itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights above flickered with the turbulence, casting Malcolm's broken figure in sharp, uneven shadows across the aisle. The flight attendants froze where they stood, their training useless in the face of the horror that had unfolded. Their leader, once a symbol of control and authority in the cabin, was reduced to a limp, shattered body draped over a tray table before crumpling to the carpet like discarded baggage. Raymond's chest heaved as he released his grip, stepping back slowly, his hands trembling though his expression remained unreadable. Malcolm's body slumped heavily to the floor, his limbs splayed awkwardly, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. For a brief moment there was silence, an eerie, suffocating pause in which no one dared to move, as though the entire cabin had been pulled into the orbit of this violent climax. Then the murmurs began again, rising into a feverish wave of noise that rippled through the passengers. Darius blinked weakly from his seat, his face pale with blood loss, his lips trembling as he forced words past the haze of agony. "Uncle, you did it." His voice was little more than a whisper, but the weight of it pressed deep into Raymond's chest. Those words carried not just relief, but a mixture of pride and fear, as though the boy could not decide whether his uncle had become his savior or something far more dangerous. Raymond knelt beside him, his hand brushing across the boy's shoulder, his gaze darting between Darius's wounded leg and the slumped body only feet away. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak words of comfort, but his own mind was already leaping ahead to the reality waiting beyond this pressurized cage of metal and fear. Arrest, trials, headlines. The world outside the fuselage would not see the pain, the humiliation, the cruelty that had led to this moment. It would see only the image, a wealthy man breaking another in front of 100 silent witnesses. The intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice brittle and edged with shock. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are diverting for an emergency landing. Please remain calm and seated." The announcement, though steady, trembled faintly, betraying the fear of a man shut away behind a locked cockpit door, trying to command order over something far beyond his control. A passenger in the front row, an older man with graying hair, whispered loudly enough for those near him to hear, "I've never seen anything like this." Never. His voice was thick with awe, not condemnation, and others nodded in agreement. Yet scattered through the rows were sharp voices calling for restraint, for order, for the authorities to be prepared. Phones remained raised, their red recording lights glowing like watchful eyes, each one capturing angles of truth and angles of judgment. Raymond could feel those eyes on him, feel the invisible jury forming in the cramped cabin. He straightened slowly, his frame tall despite the confines of the aisle, and met the stares without flinching. His jaw was set, his gaze unwavering, but inside, his thoughts churned. Would they see him as protector or as executioner? Would they understand that he had not acted from malice but from the desperate fury of a man watching his nephew broken in front of him? Or would they see only the crack, the snap, the irreversible moment of vengeance carried out on something as ordinary as a tray table? Malcolm moaned faintly, his body twitching with the remnants of pain, though his authority was extinguished. The attendants, still frozen, looked torn between aiding him and shrinking back in fear of their passenger-turned-avenger. None of them moved, the weight of silence pressing harder than the turbulence had moments before. Raymond's fists unclenched slowly, his palms raw from the force of his grip. He turned back to Darius, who stared at him with wide, unsteady eyes. The boy's expression was not of a child looking at an uncle. It was of a witness looking at the man who had just rewritten the balance of power inside a steel prison in the sky. The murmurs grew louder, rippling back and forth like tides clashing on the shore. A man near the middle row muttered, "He had no choice. That boy would have died without help." Another countered, "He went too far. He broke him." The arguments rose and fell, but every voice was part of the same courtroom that Raymond now stood in, every passenger a juror deciding his fate before the ground ever came into view. The pilot's voice returned, firmer this time. "We ask all passengers to remain seated. Emergency teams are awaiting us. Please remain calm." Yet even his command could not soften the truth vibrating in the cabin, the truth that no one would forget this flight, no matter how many apologies or explanations followed. Raymond glanced once more at Malcolm's body, then back at his nephew. In that instant, clarity settled like a stone in his heart. Whatever awaited him beyond these walls, arrest, condemnation, endless questions, was inevitable. What mattered was that the boy beside him still breathed, still had a chance to walk out of this nightmare alive. And so he sat, shoulders heavy but head unbowed, as the hum of the engines deepened and the lights flickered against the silent tension. The verdict of the world would come later. For now, the stage remained here, and every stair pressed down like a gavel ready to fall. The cabin now felt like a courtroom, every passenger a juror, their verdict still undecided. The plane had become a stage, and Raymond's act was the performance of his life. The jet shuddered as it began its descent, the familiar hum of the engines deepened by the heavy silence inside the cabin. Malcolm moaned faintly from the floor, his body twisted unnaturally, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His once sharp posture, the stance he used to intimidate others, had vanished. Now he was a crippled shadow of the tyrant who had towered over the passengers only minutes before. The air inside the fuselage seemed thicker, filled with whispers, the stifled sobs of frightened travelers, and the unsteady breathing of those who had seen too much. Every pair of eyes carried the same question. What would happen once the wheels touched the ground? Near the center aisle, Raymond knelt beside his nephew, his hands pressed firmly against the blood-soaked fabric of Darius's leg, but the stain spread stubbornly, a vivid red reminder of the cruelty that had ignited this storm. Darius's face was pale, his eyelids fluttering with exhaustion, but his lips trembled into faint movement. "Uncle, is it over?" he whispered, the words barely audible. Raymond leaned closer, his jaw tight, his voice a controlled mix of anger and comfort. "It's over for him. Not for us." His hand gripped Darius's with a strength that carried both promise and desperation. The boy's weak squeeze in return felt like a plea to hold on, not just physically but to something greater: dignity, justice, survival. Around them, the passengers shifted, unable to ignore the gravity of what they had witnessed. A middle-aged man rose from his seat, his steps unsteady as he made his way down the aisle. He crouched beside Raymond, his voice low, respectful, carrying the weight of shared truth. "I saw everything," he said, his eyes glancing briefly at Malcolm's broken figure before hardening with conviction. "You did what needed to be done." His words rippled outward like a signal, and soon others followed, nods, murmurs of agreement, voices whispering support. Yet not every passenger was convinced. From the back, a man muttered under his breath about lawsuits, about how violence could never be justified. His companion hushed him, but the note of dissent lingered, a reminder that truth was fragile when wrapped in human opinion. Raymond's eyes, sharp and unwavering, stayed locked on his nephew, but his ears absorbed every sound. The support comforted him, but the murmurs of doubt cut deep. hinting at the battle yet to come. He glanced at Malcolm, whose body stirred weakly. The senior attendant groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Pain twisted his face, yet even now hatred burned faintly in his gaze. He tried to speak, his words broken and rasping. "You will pay." His voice trailed into silence as medics were called over the intercom, though he remained conscious enough to radiate venom. The irony struck Raymond with bitter force. Malcolm had once used rules and authority to demean others, but now his downfall had come not from policies or order, but from the very object he had mocked as weak and breakable. The tray table, once a symbol of fragility, had become his undoing. Darius stirred again, drawing Raymond back to the center of his world. The boy's eyes glistened, not just from pain, but from the conflict boiling inside him. Relief and fear clashed in equal measure on his young face. "Uncle," he whispered, his voice quivering with exhaustion, "you didn't let him win." His words were filled with both admiration and uncertainty, as if he struggled to reconcile the violence with the justice it represented. Raymond brushed a hand over his nephew's damp forehead, his voice soft but steady. "He broke you. I couldn't let him walk away from that." The honesty of the statement lingered, filling the boy with pride, but also with unease at the cost of that vengeance. The captain's voice crackled overhead, his calm tone failing to mask urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have declared a medical emergency. Emergency services will be awaiting us upon landing. Please remain seated." The words rolled through the cabin, grounding the passengers back in reality. Some clasped hands together in prayer, their whispered pleas filling the air like distant echoes. Others continued to film, phones still raised, determined to preserve every second for the world beyond the cabin walls. The glow of screens reflected off weary faces, each recording another angle of the truth, another version of the same moment that would soon divide the world between condemnation and praise. Raymond sat rigid, his mind caught between past and future. He had not acted out of impulse alone. Every movement had been a choice, every word a blade sharpened by love for his nephew. But now, as the cabin tilted downward and the city lights began to flicker faintly through the oval windows, he felt the weight of consequences pressing down harder than the gravity of dissent. Lawsuits, arrest, headlines. He could almost hear them forming already, the words CEO and violence strung together in damning simplicity. Yet within him, another voice rose higher, the voice of justice, of defiance, whispering that his act was not destruction, but protection. The descent tightened the atmosphere even further, pressing every passenger against their seats as the cabin lights dimmed. Malcolm's faint groans mixed with the hum of engines, a cruel reminder that he still lived, still carried the potential to twist the truth if given the chance. Raymond's hand pressed harder into the wound on Darius's leg, his knuckles white, his focus absolute. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice low but fierce. The boy blinked slowly, his lips parting in a faint smile that seemed to whisper gratitude even as his strength ebbed. In the silence that followed, foreshadowing coiled like a serpent around Raymond's thoughts. The ground was rushing up to meet them, but he knew instinctively that the true impact of this night would not come with the landing gear striking the runway. It would come later, when judgment, public opinion, and law all collided in ways he could not yet predict. Still, he held on to his nephew's hand, his gaze steady, his voice a whisper to himself as much as to the boy. "We're not finished." Not yet. The jet roared as it descended through the final clouds, its body trembling under the strain of descent. Inside, every heart braced for the landing, but Raymond already understood the truth. The blood, the broken body, the whispered support and doubts, they were only the beginning of a battle that would stretch far beyond the runway. His nephew's broken leg was proof of cruelty, but his own response had been proof of power. And as the wheels prepared to meet the earth, one final thought seared itself into his mind like a verdict he could not escape. The ground was rushing up to meet them, but the true impact would be felt long after they landed. The plane touched down hard, wheels screeching against the tarmac as the fuselage shuddered violently, throwing passengers against their seatbelts. Outside the narrow windows, red and blue lights flashed, emergency vehicles racing alongside the aircraft like predators closing in on wounded prey. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with dread and adrenaline, every man bracing for the confrontation they knew was moments away. When the cabin doors hissed open, A cold gust of night air swept inside, carrying the metallic smell of fuel and the sharp echo of urgent commands shouted on the runway. Uniformed officers stormed in, weapons drawn, their boots pounding against the aisle floor with military precision. Yet, when their eyes fell on the scene, a 17-year-old boy, pale and broken on a stretcher, a crippled attendant strapped down and groaning, and a CEO standing defiantly in the center of it all, they faltered. The authority they carried into the cabin was suddenly tested by the sight of dozens of passengers lifting their phones, their screens glowing like beacons of truth. The passengers did not scream in panic. Instead, they shouted with conviction. "He saved that boy," one man's voice rang out, trembling not with fear but with fury. His hands shook as he held his phone higher, the recording replaying the brutal kick that had shattered Darius's leg. Another voice followed, deeper, steady, almost like a judge delivering a verdict. "He defended him." The officers exchanged glances, their grips tightening on their weapons as hesitation seeped into their movements. The protocol was clear. Restrain the man responsible for violence on board. But nothing about this cabin felt clear. Every aisle was lined with men standing firm, their expressions hard, their voices carrying a weight that the officers could not ignore. Medics pushed through the crowd, their focus solely on Darius. His face was pale, lips trembling as they lifted him gently onto a stretcher. "Hold still, son," one medic said firmly, though his voice betrayed a note of pity. The boy winced, clutching Raymond's hand weakly before being wheeled toward the door. Raymond bent low, whispering words that only Darius could hear. "You're safe now. I won't let them take that from you." Malcolm was next, dragged out on a gurney with straps pulled tight across his torso. His groans echoed like a bitter reminder of what had been done to him. His eyes burned with hate, darting toward Raymond as if still daring to accuse him, even as his body lay broken. But that hatred was hollow now, extinguished by the weight of his own cruelty revealed to the world. The passengers leaned away as he passed, no sympathy in their stares. His authority had dissolved the moment the cameras captured the truth. The officers moved closer to Raymond, their formation tightening, voices low but commanding. "Sir, you need to surrender now, hands where we can see them." Their tone carried the weight of law, but their eyes betrayed unease. Behind them, the chants of passengers grew louder, swelling into a wave that pressed against the men with guns. Raymond raised his hands slowly, not in fear, but in calm defiance. His heart pounded, but his mind was sharp. He studied the officers' hesitation, the way their eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd of witnesses. These men were not blind. They knew the moment was larger than procedure. He spoke with quiet clarity, his voice cutting through the noise. "You've seen their recordings. You know what happened. I defended my nephew when no one else would." The lead officer, a tall man with sweat glistening on his brow, faltered. He lowered his weapon an inch, the conflict clear on his face. Behind him, passengers pressed forward, voices overlapping, phones thrust high into the air. "We saw it all." "He's not the criminal here," one shouted. Another man added, his voice heavy with emotion, "If you arrest him, you arrest justice itself." Raymond's chest rose and fell heavily as he looked around the cabin. Every man who had once been a stranger was now a silent ally, their loyalty bound not by friendship but by shared outrage. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a strange sense of strength, one not born of power or wealth, but of truth. The irony was not lost on him. He had snapped a man's spine in rage, yet his greatest weapon was not his fists or his fury. It was the undeniable evidence glowing on the screens of those who had chosen not to stay silent. The officers stood frozen at the crossroads of duty and conscience, their weapons still drawn, but their authority slipping with every chant, every voice that rose in Raymond's defense. The cabin was no longer a scene of chaos. It was a courtroom in the sky, and the verdict was already being delivered. For the first time, Raymond realized his greatest weapon wasn't his fists or his rage, it was the truth, recorded by witnesses who refused to stay silent. Justice had already begun in the cabin before any courtroom could claim it. The footage had barely left the cabin before it became the storm outside. News channels replayed the scene on an endless loop. Raymond Colton, the polished CEO, towering over the flight attendant who only hours before had commanded the aisle with arrogance. The sickening crack of bone against the tray table echoed through living rooms, offices, and coffee shops across the nation. Each replay seemed louder, more haunting, forcing every viewer to choose a side, barbarity or justice. Reporters debated not just the act itself but the meaning behind it, their words sharpened by the contrast between Raymond's composed corporate image and the raw violence captured on shaky phone cameras. In a sterile hospital room, Darius lay propped against pillows, his leg heavily bandaged, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to the air. The boy's face was pale but steady as microphones crowded toward him. "My uncle didn't just protect me. He showed the world that my life mattered," he said, his voice breaking at the edges yet filled with conviction. The statement rippled outward like a stone dropped in water, igniting conversations far beyond the hospital walls. Nurses paused in corridors to whisper about it. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. For many, those words were not just testimony, but a verdict. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to contain the damage. Press conferences were hastily arranged in brightly lit halls where company spokesmen read carefully scripted lines about safety, regret, and thorough investigation. Yet no polished phrase could erase the frozen image of Malcolm Keene, slumped and broken across a flimsy tray table. The public remembered the cruelty in his smirk, the indifference in his voice, and the arrogance in his stance long before Raymond's hands had reached for him. Every attempt at apology sounded hollow, drowned out by the footage that needed no narration. Raymond, though, carried the heavier weight. In quiet hotel rooms where he hid from the storm of cameras, he replayed the incident in his mind, his thoughts torn between pride and dread. He had not planned to become a symbol. He had only meant to protect the boy who bore his family's name. But symbols are rarely chosen. They are forged in moments when action overwhelms consequence. Strangers approached him in airports, grocery stores, even outside courthouses, pressing his hand tightly, whispering, "Thank you for standing up when no one else would." Their gratitude steadied him, but it also deepened the conflict within. Was he a hero, or had he crossed a line from which there was no return? The lawsuits arrived quickly, thick envelopes delivered by stern-faced men in suits. Investigations followed, each one dissecting every angle of the footage, every movement of his hands, every flicker of expression. Lawyers warned him to remain silent, but silence was a luxury he could no longer afford. The world had already spoken for him, dividing itself into those who called him a monster and those who called him a defender. And within that divide, the truth twisted into something larger than a single act of violence. It became a question of justice, of what men owe to the vulnerable seated beside them in life's narrow aisles. At night, Raymond's dreams betrayed him. He saw the tray table not as plastic but as an altar, a place where both cruelty and justice had collided. He woke in sweats, his heart pounding, wondering whether history would remember him as a protector or as a man who snapped. Yet every morning, when he visited Darius in the hospital, the boy's smile steadied him. Darius's recovery was slow, marked by pain and restless nights, but his spirit seemed stronger than before. "You did what you had to do," he whispered one morning, gripping his uncle's hand with surprising strength. That simple affirmation carried Raymond through the darkest hours. Public squares filled with voices, some chanting for punishment, others demanding recognition of a man who had defended the powerless. Television hosts framed the incident as a clash of two Americas, one ruled by hierarchy and cruelty, the other longing for accountability and courage. Raymond's own voice was lost in the noise, his words drowned out by the very storm his act had unleashed. But within him, the objective remained the same. He had not fought for reputation or legacy, only for the boy who had whispered not to let cruelty win. The irony of his life was sharp. For decades he had measured power in balance sheets, quarterly reports, and polished boardrooms. He had thought his legacy would be defined by mergers and technological advances, his name etched into the walls of corporate history. Instead, it was the crack of a tray table, the gasp of a cabin, and the cry of a boy that carved his name into memory. Raymond's empire of contracts and shareholders paled beside the single act that now defined him. And so he walked into each day with a strange duality, condemned by some, celebrated by others, yet unable to change what had already been done. He could only endure the storm, steady as a man who had acted not for glory, but for love. And though the road ahead was lined with charges and scrutiny, he knew that nothing could undo the moment when he chose dignity over silence. The tray table was no longer furniture. It was history's witness. Minutes later, the father struck back. The same tray table became the flight attendant's downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: The story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, cruelty, and retaliation against abuse of authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke reflection on accountability, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and equality.